Yeah.
Okay, good,
Yeah.
because I don't, some people can? Everyone can. Okay, good. Because I don't want to use the mic, I don't like it, I find it intrusive and terrible. So as some of you who are looking at the slides may have noticed, the title of the talk has changed, and in fact, the entire topic has changed. After yesterday, and I saw what other people were talking about, I realized that the talk I plan to give really doesn't fit in very well with what other people are saying, so I thought I would present some new data, which means this talk might be a little bit rough, but hopefully that also means that it's exciting, depending on your tastes. The title of this conference is The Varieties of Self. When a few of us were riding over this morning from the hotel, we were talking about the different sort of cultures and presentation depending on the discipline that people are coming from, and it struck me that what we're also getting a taste of in this conference is different cultures and how people from different disciplines give talks, how they present their ideas, one of which probably is the use of PowerPoint, but also I'm going to be showing some graphs and so forth. And to that end, I just wanted to issue a warning. There will be data, lots of it. Really almost nothing but data. I'm going to inundate you, and sort of my hope is just to cow you with the data so that no one can argue with me. No, that's not true. The arguing about the interpretation of the data, I guess, is the fun part, at least for us psychologists. So with that in mind, here's a little bit of background about some of the research that I've been doing recently, which is on the self and conceptions of identity, which, as many of you know in the audience, change across different cultures and religious traditions. So the one that we're in the room probably most familiar with is the Western idea of the self. I put Abrahamic here, which is meant to be inclusive of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Within this tradition, there is very much a sense of a continuous self. Another word that's often used is soul. This is a sort of placeholder notion for this continuous self that lasts throughout one's lifetime and indeed persists after death. So it's indestructible, right? The physical body may die, but the self or the soul remains. This sort of thought is so pervasive that it shows up in many, many different ways when we think about ourselves. And I'll just give you one example called the end of history illusion, which is a pretty new finding. There was a paper that came out a couple years ago in Science that found the following. So this is meant to explore people's sense that the preferences that they have now will be the same, I guess, in the future. On this task, you would do something like the following. You'd say, all right, what is your favorite type of music, or your favorite band right now? And people might say something, I wish I thought about this before, but they might say something like Justin Bieber. I don't know if you have a bad taste in music. And then you'd say, okay, well, what about 20 years ago? What was your taste in music? You might say, I don't know, Britney Spears. And then what happens is you ask people now in the future, how different do you think your musical taste will be? For instance, there are lots of preferences looked at, but just in the instance of music. And people tend to say, oh, I'll still like Justin Bieber, even though they've been faced with very explicit sort of evidence that their musical tastes have evolved over time. And so the reason this is called the end of history illusion is because people tend to think that the self is continuous, even when you've given them explicit evidence otherwise, right? You just had them tell you that they actually changed a lot, but they believe that right now, that's when I'm going to stop changing. That's when I'm going to be the continuous person. Okay. And this data, importantly, only comes from Westerners. So we don't know yet whether it would also extend to other populations that might have a different idea of the self. So let's look at some of those. In Hinduism, actually, has a very similar conception of the self as the Western notion. There's a continuous self, and specifically this continuous self as the Atman. It's very similar. I guess people who were here at the talk yesterday will know is a sort of I should take it connected with moral capacities it's sort of the equivalent of the soul in Hinduism. And there's also belief in reincarnation. So there's a life after death that actually involves going into another body rather than just leaving the body and then floating off to heaven or wherever else you might deserve to go in your hammock. Now, radically different conception of the self comes from Buddhism. There is, and I apologize, there's this sort of some, repeating from yesterday. But so the Buddhists believe there's no continuous self at all. And there is a rebirth after death, but not in the form of reincarnation. And the rebirth, really, the difference between what happens at death is, at least doctrinally, seen as the same thing as what happens from moment to moment. So you're completely different from the person you will be in a year, or the person that you were a year ago. The self is ever changing. And part of the reason why Buddhism has been studied, I think this is of such interest, especially to people in this room, is because their concept of the self is radically different from many, many other religious and cultural beliefs. And there's a question that we can now ask, which is how much does having this different belief actually affect on the ground our behavior, or the Buddhist behavior and deeply held beliefs. It's just a New Yorker cartoon I found. It says, this week, on the amazing race to enlightenment, can Jim and Susie achieve right mindfulness? And will Barb and Candy be eliminated for relentless clinging to the self? So the idea here is that it is very alien to, I guess, New Yorker readers. The idea that it's weird to cling to a notion of the self. All right, so as I said, our primary question here is, how do these doctrines actually impact the way we think of the self? Or when I say we, I mean people generally, so how Buddhists think, how Hindus think, and sort of more to the point, are these explicitly held beliefs that we might have about the self, do they reflect in any direct or indirect way implicit beliefs about the self that are evident from behavior or other types of more indirect reporting about identity in the self? Now there is some precedent, I guess, for the data I'm about to get into, and we've got a ton of time, so I just thought I'd give just one example so that it doesn't seem like I'm picking on Buddhists later in this talk. But in Christianity, it's taught that God is everywhere. He knows everything, and his power is limitless. And so if you ask a Christian, well, what is the nature of God? What's the deal with him? They'll say this stuff. Oh, he's omniscient, he's omnipresent, he's omnipotent. But then when you sort of give them more indirect tests, for example, you might give them a story about God is like saving a man who's drowning, but then there's another man who's drowning, and you say, well, why didn't God save the other man? Sometimes you just get people spontaneously saying things like, well, he was busy saving the other guy. But if God is everywhere and omnipotent, then this should be no barrier to him. And so it seems what people are doing is they're just spontaneously attributing to God, they're giving him very sort of mortal or human-like mental capacities and limiting him in a way that the physical world usually limits people who are on Earth. So this is a very clear case where the explicit doctrine and the implicit way that we spontaneously think about figures in the doctrine diverge. Okay? So explicit beliefs and implicit beliefs don't necessarily match up in religion, and then we're going to look at a case with the self and see how those two things match up or don't match up. Okay, so overview, again, warning, lots of data. I'm going to show you some explicit measures, and when I say that, what I mean is we're just going to ask people directly, what do you believe about the self? Right? I'm going to show you some data from the end of history illusion cross-culturally, data about psychological essentialism cross-culturally, and when I say this, what I mean is the extent to which you believe that certain entities have a persisting essence, not just people, right, but is there some essential hoarseness to a horse that makes a horse what it is, aside maybe from its physical characteristics. We're going to see how these beliefs impact fear of death and fear of self-annihilation. We're going to also look at how this might impact acts of selflessness, so generosity, charitable giving. And finally, this last little part is what I would have talked about with the other thing. I'm just contracting it now to a couple of slides. But intuitions about personal identities, the persisting identity of other persons. And before I continue, these two distinguished-looking characters are my collaborators on these projects, Sean Nichols and Jay Garfield. And so just keep that in mind throughout their spirit should sort of be looking over us as we look at the data. They are actually the ones who collected the data in India and Tibet. And I was jealous initially that they got to go collect the data and I had to stay at home in my PJs and wait for them to come back. But then when they returned, they had intestinal parasites. I didn't feel so bad anymore. But note that about, I guess, field work is that it's very interesting and then also sort of hazardous to the intestinal tract. All right, so the data that I'm going to show you comes from three populations. One are Tibetans who are actually in settlements in India. Now, there was a bit of a mess up with the way that what we wanted to have farmer data for both the Indians and the Tibetans. But what we got instead was 75% of our Tibetans are actually studying to be lamas. So they're in the Tibetan priesthood or studying to be. If anything, I mean, this is worth keeping in mind for a couple of reasons. One of which is to the extent that you're skeptical about the stuff I'm about to show you, you should know that these are not just half-assed Buddhists, right? These are people who are committed to these views and who, if anything, should show sort of the expected Buddhist effects stronger than people who might have less of a sort of commitment to it and study the doctrine, less intently. Then our Hindus are coming from the Varanasi area in India. And I don't actually even know if that's in the Varanasi area. That's just a picture of people in India. And then I'm calling Abrahamics, but really in our sample end up being almost all Christian. For the record, when we break down our data by depending on what religion within this, it doesn't matter. It's showing the same pattern. Actually, as you'll see later on, it doesn't even seem to matter whether they're religious or not. So even our non-believing American Western subjects are reporting performing these tasks very similarly. Okay. So let's start with the explicit measures. This is a question meant about connectedness. I'll just read it. And this is, before I continue, in case there's any concern about this, all of these surveys that we gave were translated into native language before we gave them, right? So now this has been translated back into English so that we can understand what we asked them. Please think about the important characteristics that make you the person you are now. Your personality, temperament, major likes and dislikes, beliefs, values, ambitions, life goals, and ideals. And please rate the degree of connectedness between the person you expect to be in 1 year compared with the person you are now, where 0 means I'll be completely different in the future, and 100 will be I will be exactly the same in the future. So on this scale, 100 is complete connectedness with the future self, and 0 is a complete disconnect with the future self. Okay, this is what we find. I haven't put the Buddhas up just because for a dramatic sort of impact. So 80 is near the top of the scale. It goes up to 100. So the Abrahamics say, yeah, I'll be very, very similar. The person I know, very similar to the person I'll be in the future. Hindus are less so, they're right in the middle. Buddhists are all the way at the bottom, almost at 0. So they're pretty much saying, the person I'll be in a year, completely different, complete disconnect. Okay, that's consistent with the doctrine, right? What about, here's another way of sort of asking a very similar thing. And we ask them, to what extent do you agree with this statement? there is some essential core that is yourself that stays exactly the same throughout your life. So now we're directly asking them about the self. Higher is they agree with it more. So that's more believing in a consistent core self. Okay. Abrahamic Hindus almost at the ceiling. Buddhists almost at floor. So they're saying, no, I don't have a core self, not at all. Okay. So now we've confirmed in two ways: an explicit sort of avowal for all the subjects, really, relating to the religious background that they come from. Okay. One of the features that it's thought that religion plays is that having a certain concept of the self, or how death, either of the self or otherwise, occurs, is a coping mechanism for death anxiety. So how do these different teachings about the self impact stress about the thought of death? So here's an item from this. The following things reassure me that death should not be feared. And we asked them to check all things that apply. There's actually a long list of things. But one of them is there is no self that stays the same across time anyway. So this is specifically one that we thought, okay, well, if there's anything that the Buddha should say that is helping them cope, it should be this thing. And let's find. Okay, yeah. So first of all, our Western subjects, they say no. And this is, by the way, proportion of people who say this, from 0 to 100. So almost 0%. This is maybe like 1 person said that, right? Many more Hindus say that that's a way that they cope with the prospect of death. And then the Buddhists, again, almost all of them say, yeah, that's why I do this, right? That is something that helps me cope with the prospect of death. Okay, again, so far everything looks great in terms of their explicit beliefs. What about sort of impermanence of the self and impermanence more generally? So here's the impermanence scale. By the way, all these scales are scales that have been used by other psychologists. They aren't like things that we made up, but I guess they're things that other people made up. But they have been like normed and validated in all the ways that one usually prefers these things to be. All right, so here's a couple of the items on the impermanence scale. Nothing lasts forever. Another item is, for the most part, the world is the same. Changes are only superficial. That's like a reverse-coded item. So if they said higher on that, it would be coded in the other direction. So here's what we find. Now this is, okay. So the Buddhists believe in not just greater impermanence, like of everything, right? So not just of the self, but it seems like these ideas about impermanence are seeping through to beliefs about impermanence of the world more generally. Buddhists are reporting this at a higher rate for both groups compared to both groups. Okay, and there's no significant difference between the American subjects and the Hindus. Okay. So what about some less explicit measures about beliefs in self? I mentioned at the beginning of the talk the end of history illusion. Just to remind you, this is the effect where subjects, so they were all Western, and they tended to think that their preferences would remain the same over time. Yeah, okay. And so our prediction here is that the Tibetan Buddhists would show less of an end of history effect. It seems to follow, right? So they think that we're always changing. So they shouldn't think that that the present moment has some special purchase on one's permanence. So here's what we find. This is now just Abrahamics. They, it's not a huge effect, but this is how similar you are with yourself, and they say that they give a higher rating to future self. So this effect is now replicating from what other people have found, just with Western subjects. No effect exists for Hindus. So there isn't that extra boost for saying be more similar in the future. Similarly, for Buddhists, this line is a completely flat, you could level your house on it, as Sean likes to say. and not only that, but there's the main effect here, right? So not only are they not giving any special privilege to how similar their future self would be, but they're just saying, me in the past, me in the future, completely different, very, very dissimilar. So this is a nice piece of evidence about, I guess, the depth to which our Buddhist sample has, I guess, internalized their beliefs about the impermanence of the self. All right. This is another sort of indirect way of getting at their beliefs in I guess, permanence of things in the world. Essentialism. So, okay, there are these famous studies in the developmental psychology literature that find the following thing, which is that if you show children, you say, okay, here's a horse. Now what scientists do to this horse is they shave its tail and its mane, and they give it antlers, and they teach it not to neigh anymore, and instead it likes frolicking in the meadows, and it looks just like this at the end of the operation. Okay, and you ask children, okay, so is this thing more a horse or a deer? And children say, that's still a horse. And you can do all the superficial stuff you want to it if you want, but it's still going to be a horse deep down. So they have this sense that there is some essential sort of horse thing that's like underneath. However, and this is not just children, adults also say this. It's just that these intuitions come online quite early. But the effect actually isn't true for so these are natural kinds. The effect doesn't show up for things that for artifacts. So if you show children or adults, these are Western children and adults, this tie, and you say, okay, now I don't know why they would be scientists. It's not a very technical operation that needs to happen in this particular case, but they make they're very long and thin, and they add little. There's a word for those little plastic things that I forget now, and then you can lace up your shoes with them. So what is this? Are these shoelaces or is this a tie? And children and adults say, no, those are shoelaces. They're comfortable saying this is totally transition. So they're not imputing any sort of permanence or essence to an artifact. It's really only the natural kinds that are getting that sort of privileged way of thinking. But what happens when we do the same task in Eastern populations? Okay. So the first thing is we find that Hindus do the same thing that our Westerners do, which is to say and this y-axis is a little bit confusing, but you should just read this as saying that the thing changed. So the higher thing means that it changed more. For the Buddhists, this line is flat. So they're not really saying that anything changed more, depending whether it's a natural kind or an artifact. So again, their sense of essentialism, not just of themselves, but also for other things in the world, seems to be radically different. Okay, so here's an interim summary of what I showed you so far. Buddhist doctrines of the no-self and of anti-essentialism, and also of impermanence, they're deeply insinuated into this population we're looking at. So this isn't, so we are seeing the no-self doctrine, evidence for it in explicit measures, just self-report. And there's also some evidence for it in these less direct measures. It also sort of serves as a sanity check for us. The Tibetan sample is doing, and the Hindu sample also is doing what you would expect based on these religious doctrines. And so the stuff I'm about to show you, which is a little off the wall, sort of becomes more surprising. Okay. So there's a few implications of the no-self doctrine. These are both sort of scientific hypotheses, but they also are present in the way that the Buddhist scholars have talked about. These ought to be the implications of this doctrine for people in their lives. The first is that Buddhists should fear death and self-annihilation less. If you sort of really internalize this belief that there is no permanent self, then the idea of self-annihilation should be trivial. Self-annihilation at death, right? Because you're always being self-annihilated. Also, you should be more selfless. If you don't really have a sense of self, this frees you up to be more giving to other people. So we gave our subjects this fear of personal death scale. There's 31 items. It breaks into several factors. I'll show you a few of the factors. But this is the one that we really cared about when we ran the study. We were like, well, this one is going to be awesome. This is the self-annihilation factor. So here's some items on it. And dying 1 year from now frightens me because of the loss of the destruction of the self. Dying 1 year from now frightens me because of the destruction of personality. So this is meant, and people rate how much they agree with this. And this is meant to measure how afraid a person is with the self being annihilated at death. And then we also gave a trade-off task. This one is a little bit maybe hard. I'll try to walk you through how this one works. Okay. And I apologize. I'm putting a lot of text on the screen today. I hope that's all right. I'm just but this is a little bit difficult to grok. Imagine that you have a terminal disease that will kill you in 6 months unless you take a medication. There's only one dose of the medication available. If you take the medication, it will prolong your life by 6 months. So if you take the medicine, you will live for 12 months instead of 6. If you don't take the medicine, it will go to someone else who has the same condition and will die in 6 months, just like you. This person is very much like you, but a stranger whom you will never meet or be in contact with. Okay? And so this is what the subject saw after reading those instructions, and they could check off. So if the medicine will allow you to live for 6 months and the other person for 1 month or less, what do you do? Do you want the medicine, or do you want someone else to have the medicine? And then they would go all through all these items, all the way up to if you live for 6 months more and the other person gets more than 5 years of life, would you give up the medicine? Okay, and this should be read as a measure of selfishness going down, right? So right here, 6 months, 6 months. That's at parity, right? That's where there's no difference between what happens to you and the other person. Someone who doesn't believe in a self, in theory at least, should not only, at the very least, they should be willing to give up their medicine at 6 months, and perhaps even less than that, right? Especially because this is what will happen 6 months from now. So if you're completely discontinuous with the person you'll be in 6 months, then what does it matter who gets the medicine? You're not even the same person. And then on the other end of it, this is sort of at the very, very top. This is the most selfish. And beyond this, the scale just doesn't even measure. And I think that this really, because we tried a bunch of different ways of writing the scale, I think that anything above this on the scale should be read as never for any amount, right? It doesn't matter how much longer the other person lives. I want those 6 months for me, okay? Again, just to reiterate what our predictions are, Buddhists should have less fear of self-annihilation. They should also be more generous in trading off months of their own life for years for another person. What do we find? Okay, so this is, at the bottom, that's a little bit, so you know, at the bottom is more fear, and at the top is less fear. So less anxiety up here. So this is what the Western subjects say. This is how afraid they are of self-annihilation. Hindus, just the same. Okay, they're afraid of it, but they are afraid of it, but not extremely. Where extremely would be at the very bottom. Buddhists, what's going on, right? So they're saying I'm more afraid of myself being annihilated at death than either of the two populations. And when we found this is really surprising to us. Why should they fear self-annihilation more than the other two populations? And so maybe, do we have this here? Yeah, okay. We also find, by the way, so if you actually do this so for individual subjects, you find a correlation between their belief in impermanence and their fear of self-annihilation. So this seems to be tracking quite directly with these other kind of beliefs about the impermanence both of the self and of the world. So one possibility is that Tibetans just have a greater fear of death overall. So we looked at that. We looked at the other items on this fear of death scale. And here's a couple of just examples. Dying 1 year from now frightens me because of missing future events. Dying 1 year from now frightens me because I will be forgotten. Dying 1 year from now frightens me because of the sorrow to relatives and friends. dying 1 year from now frightens me because of the unknown associated with it. And so these are all loading onto different factors, but not ones that are directly related to the annihilation of self. All right, so here's what we find. The Buddhists are performing the same on all these items, other than self-annihilation. So it's not even that they're like any more afraid of death just for this one specific aspect, but it's sort of almost the reverse of what you would expect, where there's comparable levels of fear of death compared to our other populations, but only increased fear of death for self-annihilation. And this is just another way of looking at the data now on the same figure, where this is the rest of the scale for our three groups of subjects, and this is specifically for the self-annihilation factor, where Buddhists are all the way down there in terms of increased fear. Okay, and so now at this point we're scrambling to figure out like what's actually going on in this data. This makes no sense, and so we're trying sort of to look at like different things that might possibly explain this finding. So one possibility is maybe it's they don't believe in an afterlife, or it's something related to that, and so that there's some kind of it's seen as this discontinuous moment because there will be no afterlife. But we don't find that. In fact, if anything, so we find this is the Buddhists are the same as our Western subjects in terms of their belief in the afterlife. Now, Buddhists believe in an afterlife; they just don't believe that the self is the same in the afterlife, right? And Hindus are actually lower than either group in terms of their beliefs in the afterlife. So that can explain it. Now let's look at the trade-off study. Again. Increased sort of numbers here, it indicates increased selfishness. And so here's what we find. So this is, the higher the number here is more selfish. And Abrahamics and Hindus, both like pretty selfish, but not compared to the Buddhists. Buddhists are very, very unwilling to give their medicine up for anyone else in the future, which is the complete opposite of what we ought to find, right? And it's not just that. This is, remember I told you that item on the scale that's sort of beyond which it really just means like you'll never give up your medicine for any amount of someone else's life. So this is the proportion of people who just chose that very bottom item. Abrahamics, Hindus, Buddhists. So it's not just that overall they're saying my life is more valuable in the future, but they're also saying my life is like infinitely valuable compared to the other, to the stranger. Okay, so this is very, very surprising. It was to us anyway. So there's a paradoxical effect here. Which is that Buddhism is supposed to mitigate this fear of the death of the self, and it's supposed to lead to more selflessness. But instead, we're finding exactly the opposite. A dramatically increased fear of death of the self, and also decreased life generosity. So here's some provisional conclusions. Before I'm going to show you a little bit more data, but I just thought I'd use some provisional conclusions first. So the Buddhists seems that they have not internalized the idea that there's no self from one year to the next. That is, within their lifetimes. As much as it's sort of hammered into them in the doctrine, it seems that they haven't internalized it at a very deep level. They've internalized it deeply enough that they'll report it, they'll parrot it back to you. But that's not indicated in other ways that you can measure their idea of themselves, at least in this lifetime. But it does seem like they've internalized the idea that there is no self from one life to the next. And in fact, it seems like that, internalizing that particular aspect of the doctrine is fueling their anxiety about death rather than allaying it. So their theological incorrectness, which is to say the disjoint between their explicitly held beliefs and their implicit sort of behavior in other domains, it doesn't seem like it's really focused on the rebirth part of the doctrine, but about their human persistence over life. And how much time do I have left?
That's a good question. 15 minutes.
Okay. So I realized as I was sort of presenting all this data, this is sort of like a depressing sort of thing. I mean, of course, the data is awesome and so it's fun, but we're also talking about like death nonstop. So I have another study that is actually was inspired by I was watching some episodes of the X-Files. So but provides additional evidence towards dissent. So we can go over that now. So this is the study that the paper that I would have given if this weren't a group of people who were specifically interested in the East versus West data. But Sean Nichols and I have been doing a lot of studies that have shown consistently across many domains that when people judge the identity of other people, so which is to say, like, if you're trying to judge whether a person that you know now is the same as you used to know, the psychological characteristic and indeed the characteristics of the person, psychological or otherwise, that seems to matter the most is whether they've retained their moral sensibilities, whether their moral traits have stayed the same, more so than any other part of their mind. And just show you one example of this. So when I was watching X-Files at this point, I guess a few years ago, sort of binging on it on Netflix, as one does, I noticed that there were several episodes where what would happen is the person's soul would leave their body and go into another body. And the curious thing was that when this happened, only some characteristics of the person would transfer into the new body. So like if they were a criminal, they would continue to be a criminal, but they wouldn't necessarily bring all their memories over. Or if they had diabetes, they wouldn't bring that over. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder if there's any sort of pattern here with our intuitions about what the soul has in it, and what it would pour over with it into other bodies, or when it's not in a body at all. And so I gave people this laundry list of items that fell into different categories. And I said, imagine that John's soul leaves his body, goes into another body. If he had this characteristic in his old body, tell us how likely it is you think that he would bring this over with him into the new body. And some of these traits were physical. So if he had a birthmark, will he still have that birthmark in the new body? Some of them related to low-level cognitive and perceptual faculties. So if John were colorblind, or if he had a really good sense of smell, is he still going to be like that in the new body? Some of them had to do with their preferences and desires, so what sort of music they like, what their career ambitions were, and so forth. And some of them had to do with John's memories. In particular, this is interesting to us because John Locke and also Derek Parfit, who as I understand is like part of this series or whatever, has specifically sort of identified, there's a philosophical tradition of identifying personal identity in one's memories. So you're only the same person that you are to the extent that you have retained a sort of continuous set of memories over time. So will he bring his memories over with him? Those are important to identity, then those should be rated as very highly likely to go over. And then finally, we ask questions about his moral traits and behaviors. So if he's a pedophile, if he's a thief, if he's honest, if he's generous, will he bring all that over with him? Now, these are just Western subjects so far. We have some cross-cultural stuff that I'll show in a second. Just to sort of ground you, this is the very first thing that we found. Here, these are the physical characteristics. What's interesting about this, at least to me, is that this isn't at 4. Now, people are still saying, like, oh, like, he'll probably, it's possible that he could bring over his fingerprints or his birthmark or something. This is for perception. What's, I guess, important to note about this is there's actually no difference between these two, the averages of these two groups. So it's not just that all aspects of the mind are valued more than any part of the body, for instance, in terms of its relationship to the self. But it seems like some parts of the mind just really aren't even that important for the self. Desires and memories, they're deemed relatively likely to be ported over into the new body, but more than anything, are the moral traits those are seen as the most likely to be brought over into the body. So we developed this task for our group of Tibetans and Indians. This is what we find. This is a different way of showing a very similar graph. So hopefully it's we can parse it together. This blue thing here, that's the Hindus, and this green bar, those are the moral items. Okay, so this is the memory items, moral items, perception, personality, preferences. We're not seeing any movement here at all. It's really, if you can, but there's this hump here indicating that for the Hindus and also for the Buddhists, they're saying the moral traits are more likely to transfer over. Even these intuitions about a self, even when sort of in the absence of a belief about the self, are deemed more important. And surprisingly also, there's a main effect here, right, where the Buddhists are saying everything's more likely to go over to the new body, which is a little bit puzzling, right, because if anything, this effect should be depressed. But in any case, we are seeing the same pattern. The same pattern of privileging the moral traits when thinking about the self for both sets of Eastern subjects. And this is now just showing this compared to the Abrahamic American subjects, just so you can get a sense of scale, because there are some differences here, right? So on the bottom, right here, are Hindus, these are the Buddhists, right in between, and now this very dramatic thing here is the Abrahamic religion people, and I've just now added in purple are non-religious Americans. These are people who say they are not believers at all, and they show basically the exact same pattern, which is also intriguing. But all four groups show this preference for moral traits. There are other differences here. The most interesting one to me, at least, is that perceptual traits are seen as just not important at all to Americans, whereas relative to the other traits for the Eastern populations, they're seen as really no different than your personality. I think it's really, really interesting. I mean, we didn't even sort of have any kind of hypothesis about that going into it, but in any case, this is what the data look like. All right. So here is my conclusional slide. So Buddhists retain a sense of the self and identity that is, in many ways at least, comparable to religions that teach about a continuous self. They do believe that the self is radically annihilated, but only after death. They're tending to believe or to behave as if the self retains some similitude during life. But this belief that the self is radically annihilated after death is, rather than allaying a fear of death, actually seems to be fueling this anxiety about death. It's possible, although this might not end up being true, but what the data seem to suggest right now is that perhaps having conceptions of the self as continuous, at least after death, might actually help with coping with the anxiety of death more than believing that the self is just always dying in some way, just because it is so fundamentally, difficult to accept the idea that you really are changing so radically throughout life. Finally, it seems that this religious doctrine, it does have the power to influence deeply held beliefs about the self, but just not all of them. With that, I will